good morning, if it's morning where you are. I'm really excited to introduce you to Annie Murphy-Paul. She's a science writer. She's written 3 books, right?
Mhm.
But you've had work published everywhere, basically. But your most recent book, The Extended Mind, is what we're going to talk a bit about today. Annie, thank you so much for joining me here today. I was wondering, so I have 2 kind of preliminary questions that I wanted to ask you. And I was wondering if we could start off by kind of talking about the story that you're telling yourself right now on why you're interested in these things, or what brought you here. Were there some pivotal moments in your childhood, or how are you explaining why you're here at this moment as a science writer and author of 3 books?
I love questions like that because those are things I think about a lot. And looking back at my own work, I've been a writer now for 25 years, and it's amazing to me how the same themes keep popping up, even when I thought I was writing about something else. I think we really, if we look back at the tracks of our own journey, you can see that you were always headed in a certain direction, even though you didn't know it. And so I find the same themes, the same ideas popping up in my work, and it's obviously something I think that I'm grappling with. I'm trying to figure out, and I think of two buckets here. One is content, and that is the content I'm always thinking about is identity. Who are we? How did we get to be the way we are? For a long time as a younger person, I was interested in how do we become who we are? And now as I'm older, as I'm in kind of middle age, I'm thinking, how do we change? How do we leave behind that person that we spent so much time and energy trying to form? And then the other bucket is kind of process, because what I love about being a writer is that, to me, it's about taking this huge mass of information drawn from all different kinds of places, because I like to work in a very interdisciplinary way, drawing from different fields and different disciplines, and making order out of it. That is very satisfying to me. And, I'm not the neatest person in my personal life. Like, my house can be sort of a wreck sometimes, but in my work, it's so satisfying to me to make something beautiful and functional, and take, as I say, like this just swarm of information and make it into something orderly that makes sense, and then share that with other people and say, maybe this will help make sense of things for you too. That's what I love about being a writer.
Were there any sort of pivotal moments, maybe? And I think a lot of mine were in adolescence, that sort of made you question or really dig into who you were?
Yeah, I never really felt at home or as if I belonged in the milieu where I grew up. I grew up in a suburb of Philadelphia that was very stuffy and preppy and kind of anti-intellectual, I would say. And there I was, this kind of bookworm who loved ideas and loved words. And I always felt a friction between who I was and the surroundings that the environment that I was in. So it was inevitable to me that I would think about, well, why am I the way I am? Why is that different from these other people? And then a lot of my adult life has been about finding the people, my tribe, the people who are like me, and not trying to conform to some idea of who I should be, but discovering ever more deeply who I am, and then connecting with people with whom I can share that sort of inner essence, which I think is always there. And it's less there's a lot of discovery involved in the journey, but there's also a lot of just uncovering what was always there. I find that more and more as I get older.
I think that's interesting, balancing that with the sort of focus right now of how do I change?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
what things do we accept and what things do we go about
Yeah.
alter? And I don't have a good answer for that.
Mm-hmm.
But this leads me to 2 points that connect back to the book. One, when you were talking about sort of sifting through all of the information, and translating it and then sharing it. I think that's really reflective of the book. But I also think it reminded me of there's a moment where you're sort of trying to redefine or reframe the sort of metaphor of the mind as a muscle. And you suggest a new metaphor. Maybe could you talk a little bit about sort of the shortcomings of the idea of the mind as a muscle and maybe some new suggestions on how we should think about it or can
Sure.
think about it?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the idea of the mind as a muscle is actually a pretty old idea. You can find it going back to the 19th century, and I'm sure before then, but it was really popularized by a psychologist named Carol Dweck and her work on what she called the growth mindset. And the growth mindset proposes that we can get smarter by practice, by effort, through determination and persistence. And she likened the brain to a muscle. It's like a muscle, you know, a physical muscle, you exercise it, it gets stronger. The brain is similar. And this has been a very hopeful and optimistic kind of vision of the brain for people. So I don't want to take that away. And I think there's a lot of value in it. But it's also limited in the sense that it really only gives you your brain to work with. And it really only gives you one thing to do with it, which is to keep working it, you know, ever harder. And I think that can get interpreted to mean that, well, to get work done, to solve problems, to think intelligently, what I need to do is sit here and sort of flog my brain like it's a workhorse until I get the job done. And that can be very frustrating. And it's not even the best way to do good thinking for many people in many situations. So what I love about the extended mind is that the idea of the extended mind, which is an idea that I borrowed from philosophy, says that actually the brain doesn't have to do it all on its own. You can bring in these resources from outside the brain, like the movements and the sensations of your body and the way the space around you is arranged, or your relationships with other people. All of these can be parts of your thinking process as well. And so the metaphor that I propose to kind of replace or maybe augment the very familiar metaphor of the brain as muscle is the brain as a magpie, which is this kind of bird that's famous for taking bits and pieces from its environment, you know, little shiny bits of yarn or tinsel, you know, and weaving those things into its nest. And I see the brain as a kind of magpie, not as this workhorse that's trying to do it all itself and being sealed inside the head, but rather kind of flitting about the environment and plucking, you know, rich resources from the environment and weaving those things into our thought processes. So to me, that's been a very fertile and generative metaphor, and it's very freeing. I find it very liberating as opposed to just thinking that the brain has to do it all by itself.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's space for both, at least for me. I was thinking this morning in the shower about this, because through points in my life, I felt really, there's this metaphor that, or not, quote by Chuck Close about how artists have to just show up. Like you show up and then something happens, but that definitely is mildly torturous in some cases. And also the idea that we can listen to our bodies if we need sleep or need a walk, that those can also be really generative. It's hard because I feel like our society has this very sort of, we have to be producing and productive and moving fast, and it is really freeing to expand that to involve other activities that might be enjoyable or like not quantifiable in sort of capitalist measure. I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about how, so there are 3 main sections in the book. You talk about thinking with your body, thinking with your surroundings, and I was really excited about thinking with your relationships. But can you kind of talk about, well, wait, maybe we should take one step back, and maybe can you talk about the theory behind the extended mind, or the philosophy that you alluded to when we were speaking just a moment ago?
Sure, yeah. So the theory of the extended mind, as I mentioned, is borrowed from philosophy. And these 2 philosophers, Andy Clark and David Chalmers, they wrote an article back in 1998 that I always like to quote the first sentence because it's of that article, because it really grabbed me and it's what drew me into this field of the extended mind and led to me sort of basing my book on the idea. The first sentence of their article said, "Where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin?" And I was really grabbed by this question because, in part, because the answer would seem to be obvious. Like, well, the conventional answer is that the mind ends at the skull, the mind is the brain, and that's, that's how we think about it. But Clark and Chalmers went on to say, no, actually, the mind extends out into the rest of the body, into our physical surroundings, into our relationships with other people. And all of these things, as I've been saying, are part of the thinking process. And this is such an exciting idea to me that I wanted to really explore the implications of that, not just leave it as this interesting philosophical concept, but to say, well, if that's true, how can we more intentionally and skillfully use these outside the brain resources to enhance our thinking? And that was the germ of the idea that sort of gave rise to the book.
So then in extension, can we go back to the 3 sections of the book and kind of, can you give us a brief overview of what you mean by thinking with our body, thinking with our surroundings, and with our relationships?
Sure, yeah. So that first section about thinking with the body is a little bit of a challenge to our Western idea, our Western habit of separating the body from separating the mind from the body, and saying that they're separate and they're in some ways opposed, which, I argue that the research really is very persuasive that that's not how thinking works at all, that we really think with our entire bodies, and it's not right to imagine that we're only thinking sort of above the neck. And so in that section, I look at 3 ways in which the body contributes to thinking. One is our interoceptive faculty. That's our ability to sense these internal cues and signals that are actually, that flow of information from the body, from within the body, is there all the time. We just are very used to sort of pushing it aside and quashing it almost deliberately. When we sit down and think we have to get some work done, we think we have to power through and override whatever the body is telling us, when really those internal signals and cues carry a lot of information, a lot of wisdom, a lot of stored experience, that if we are more deliberately paying attention to those internal signals, we can really benefit from what the body knows. And then the other 2 sections are about gestures, which I've been moving my hands around a lot, and I feel less bad about that now because I tend to be a gesturer. But in fact, gestures, interestingly enough, are often a few milliseconds ahead of where our verbal thought processes are, or where our spoken language is. People's most cutting edge and newest and most advanced ideas often show up first in the way they're moving their hands, and then we kind of read off our own gestures to inform our sort of burgeoning, verbal explanation or description of what we're thinking about. And then finally, I talk about movement. Did you want to say something, Chris?
Oh, could we pause there for just a moment?
Yeah,
If there are any sort of studies, or how are researchers kind of going about this sort of examining this sort of understanding through our bodies and hands before our conscious sort of verbal awareness arises? Yeah,
well, I talk about two bodies of research in that chapter, at least, many bodies of research, but 2 come to mind. One is a researcher who videotaped conversations between doctors and patients. And you can actually see in these videos, like a patient will say, she'll be talking about the stress that she's feeling, and she'll say, I just go round and round each day trying to get my bills paid, trying to get everything done. And a few milliseconds before she says round and round, she starts moving her hands, to indicate that. And meanwhile, the doctor starts nodding like, I get it, I hear you, like a few milliseconds before she's even said anything, because he gets what she's saying just by what she's saying with her hands. So it's amazing to watch and to think, actually, the words are almost beside the point. Like, these people are having a whole conversation just with their gestures. And actually, linguists believe that gestures came along long before humans evolved spoken language. So gestures really like our first language, and it's not just a kind of clumsy add-on to our verbal language, because we do tend to elevate and prioritize verbal language in our culture, but gestures really like the original language, and one that is still kind of often leading the way. And that's what emerged out of the second body of research that I'm thinking of, which looked at children and how they solve simple problems about conservation of matter. For example, when you pour a tall, skinny glass of water into a wide, shallow glass, like these Piaget experiments. Yeah. And then ask a child to explain, like, is there still the same amount of water, or is there less water? And children will say one thing. Children who are beginning to figure this out will say, oh, there's less water, because it looks like the level of water is lower in the shallow glass. But they'll, at the same time, they'll be moving their hands in ways that suggest that they're beginning to understand that actually the amount of water is still the same. And what's so fascinating is that research suggests that when there's a mismatch between what a child or an adult is saying and what their hands are indicating, it's really the hands that are leading the way, again, that are having the most advanced ideas. And that in that moment of transition where there's a mismatch between what people are saying and what their hands are indicating, that's a moment when we're really receptive to instruction. Really, we're just on the cusp of figuring it out. And if a teacher can step in at that moment, or a parent, and say, and nudge that along a little bit, or call attention maybe to what the child is doing with their hands, that's a moment when children are especially ready to learn and will get that idea right away, because they're almost there, and the gesture is actually showing that they are almost there.
I think it's sort of, wait, we should finish with the original question of continuing about, we needed to talk a little bit about how our surroundings sort of also function for things.
Yes.
And our relationship. And sorry, I have so much to ask.
That's okay. There's a lot in this book. It covers a lot of ground. And I should say that the third part of the thinking with the body is about movement, and how movement is moving the body in big ways, not just gesture. It can be a part of thinking. And then the second section is about the way that our surroundings affect the way we think. Human beings are very context sensitive. The way we think is really influenced by the place where we are. And one of the most powerful contexts for thinking turns out to be nature, the outdoors. And what's fascinating to me about that, we kind of all know that it's good to get outside. We feel good when we're in nature, but there's a reason for that. The human brain evolved in the outdoors. This life where we spend almost all our time inside is like a very recent development, evolutionarily speaking. And so the kind of information, the kind of stimuli that we encounter when we're outdoors, it's very easy for our brains to process. Like, it's very easy and effortless for our brains to look at trees and sky and water. And that's why we find it so relaxing and restorative to be in nature, because we're not having to really intently focus the way we do when we're working or learning. But nature's also sort of pleasantly diverting and interesting. It's not boring at all, but it's also not demanding. And so when we spend time in nature, that actually kind of refills the tank of our attentional resources. That's the tank that we're constantly drawing down when we're focusing and working inside, or when we're navigating an urban environment. So I think it's important to think about not just how are we spending or managing our attention, but how are we restoring it? How are we replenishing it? And going outside is the best way to do that.
Do you have any other sort of surrounding adaptations that people can take, or recommendations to sort of fill their bucket?
I do. I mean, then there's the question of interior spaces and how we arrange those. And some research that I find really meaningful is that it's important to fill our spaces with cues of identity, like reminders of who we are, and maybe in particular who we are in that particular setting. Like, are you are in this setting, are you being an artist? Are you being a parent? Are you being a friend? Are you being a professional? Because our identities are very fluid, and it really helps to have reminders and primes or cues of who we are. And then also cues of belonging, cues that remind us that we belong to these valued groups, that we're not alone, even when we are, working in a solitary way, we're still connected to these meaningful groups. So if we can think about arranging our spaces in terms of reflecting back to us, these aspects of our identity and these aspects of our social connections, that can really put us in a good place to do really good work.
It's interesting. It's difficult for me to sit through in my mind what of these things are like confirmation bias that I do already, or like what, because I think that really those spending time in nature, it's not been until recently that I've felt how impactful that has been, especially during lockdown. How, I don't know how people did it where you couldn't spend time in nature. Really don't. But then also like having these as a person who makes things, how important it is to have these reminders of belonging and inspiration surrounded like visually. I also didn't realize this. I'm married to an architect who spent a considerable amount of time thinking about how spaces can reflect actions, and actions can reflect spaces, and what do you want to be done in a space. And I think that he would really, I would be really interested in what he thought about this work. But then finally, all of this is really exciting, but and we're way out of time. Thinking about our relationships, and then I'm going to have you share your secret, and then we have to go because you are super generous to give us this long. But anyway, thinking with our relationships, because this one is like, for me, I've been thinking a lot about collective consciousness and other ways we inform each other below our sort of cognitive level, or I think to use what the words you said earlier, putting words to kind of our thoughts.
Yeah. We live in this very individualistic culture that imagines, again, that thinking happens inside the skull of one individual. And that's really not how human culture works, how human thought works. We are constantly being informed by and affected and influenced by other people, and vice versa. So, and I think it's even more important than it has ever been in our history to learn how to think well as a group, because the challenges of our world are so daunting. The expertise that's required to address them is so specialized. There's so much information coming in at us all the time that the singular biological brain is really not up to the task. We really need to join our brains together into, what psychologists call a group mind, and generate, again, what they call collective intelligence, which is like, a group of people thinking together in a way that becomes more than the sum of their parts, of the individual members. And, all of that sounds pretty like kind of high tech. And, I'm saying that this is what the modern world demands. But what's so interesting is that the way to get there is actually to kind of hack these very ancient, visceral kinds of mechanisms that human beings evolved to do this, to think together, to be a group rather than just a collection of isolated individuals. So I write in the book about the power of synchronized movement, like people moving together in the same way at the same time kind of blurs the distinctions that we usually make between you and me and him and her, and then other things that help create what psychologists literally they use this word, a sense of groupiness, like how groupy is your team, and teams do vary on that dimension. Things like having emotional experiences together, things like engaging in rituals together, and that could even be just like sharing meals together, learning together and training together rather than being trained separately and then coming together and trying to figure out how to work together. These are all things that we need to get a lot better at and to integrate into our education system and our workplaces, because as I say, the model in which like the individual genius kind of solves the problem or makes the discovery is not really how things work anymore.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask you, Annie, for your secret.
Yeah.
Were you able to come up with one?
I was, yeah. Carissa, you and I were talking a moment ago about before we started recording this about imposter syndrome, and I've been introduced to audiences many, many times over the past year since my book came out, and I'm described always, and I describe myself as a science writer, but my secret is that I've never felt like I really am a science writer, because to me, a science writer is someone who writes about like geology or like astronomy or like real science, and I know that this is a little bit of a hang up that the social sciences have in general, that where it's not a real science. But I almost wish that there was another word for what I do, because it's not so much science that I love, it's the study of human nature and human behavior, and anything that has anything to do with people, I'm interested in. And I could never write an article about rocks or about like going to Mars, I just couldn't do it. But if it's about human beings, like I'm there, So maybe I should call myself a social science writer or a human being writer. I don't know, but science writer has never really felt like it describes what I do. And I've never really admitted that before.
I really thank you for talking about that with me.
Mhm.
It's difficult for me to believe that you've never admitted that before, because that seems like such a core, like every time I look like on your website or when I've read articles by you, you're always described as a science writer.
Right.
But I really like you just use the human being writer, I think. Which I think that this distinction actually is quite important, that like it isn't, because I think that like a science writer in a sense has like, there is some legitimacy, or like use the term elevation earlier, but like there's a sort of
There's a hierarchy. Yeah.
But really it does sort of bypass the sort of human aspect that I do really feel like is integral to where your interests lie. Which is kind of exciting and interesting in itself. And what would happen if we met on a plane tomorrow and you introduced yourself as a
human
being writer?
You might look to move to another seat, maybe.
I feel really bad. I'm always the person on the plane. Prior to COVID, because I haven't been on a plane, I loved talking to my neighbors, and people always make jokes about how they hate the person next to them that wants to talk. But I feel like it's like this, for me, I think about it as an experiment, and I'm never going to see these people again. And I also like, it gives me this opportunity to meet someone who's completely outside of my sort of enclave, if that's the right word. I wanted to sort of end on just talking about if there are things that we can do to sort of tap into our bodies and sort of check in, and also how we learn to kind of decipher the information when we've been taught all of our lives to be that our mind is the rational creature, but also sort of how to integrate the information that our body's giving us, and decipher when to go with our body and our gut, and our mind.
Yeah. This is something I've thought about a lot, because a lot of us, during COVID in particular, a lot of us have become sort of divorced from our bodies. It's easy to forget that we have a body when we're just kind of like, all we see is our head in this little box on the screen all day, but the body's always there, the body's always there for us. Our breathing, our heart rate, all those things are always going on. And it really is just waiting for us to tune into it and to pay attention, And so I describe in the book this simple exercise called a body scan, which is like, starts off many meditation sessions. So maybe some of your listeners who've done meditation have experienced it, but basically it just means bringing open-minded, curious, non-judgmental attention to what's going on inside your body at that moment. And, it can often involve sort of focusing on one part of your body at a time, starting with your feet, moving up through your legs and your torso and your arms, and finally your neck and your shoulder and your head, and just seeing what's there, and what's so amazing is that, again, when we forget that we have a body, and then we're not just sort of like a brain on legs. It's all like there's so much going on there. And so what I try to do is not even so much like a formal body scan practice, but just like make sure to check in a few times a day. Like what, not just because there's so much information and so much stimuli out there, you know, that it's really a kind of revolution to instead take a quiet moment to look inside. And there's a lot going on in there too. And to kind of keep that balance so that it doesn't get so out of balance that we're so focused on the outside and all that stimuli coming at us, but that we're also paying attention to what's going on inside, and to oscillate almost between those two states and allow them to inform each other. Like that to me has been a very useful piece of information, of research that I've put to use in my own life.
Thank you so much, Annie. Everyone, the Extended Mind is out now. Also, Origins and the Cult of Personality, which we didn't even get to touch on.
I know.
I will
Ahead of
put in the
time.
links in this email. Thank you so much for your research,
you,
for your way of
Carissa.
thinking. And I really feel like the ideas in this book will be generative in sort of, there's lots of times recently where I felt super hopeless or like I don't know a path forward, but I feel like there's this sort of shift in mindset in the Extended Mind is really gives me a lot of opportunities for possibilities in the future that I can envision and enjoy and get excited by. So thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you, Carissa.